Well, it was a short strike for Air Canada, lasting less than 12 hours. Flight attendants hit the picket lines early Saturday after talks with the airline broke down. But by that afternoon, the federal government stepped in, ordering both sides into binding arbitration and directing workers back to their posts. The move allowed Air Canada to begin resuming flights today, but the fallout is just beginning. Joining us now to break this down is Barry Eidlin, labor expert and sociology professor at McGill University. Barry, thanks for this.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, so why do you think Ottawa stepped in so quickly, and were you surprised?
I was disappointed but not surprised. What's interesting here is that unlike, for example, Canada Post, where or the rail or the ports, where there was maybe a bit more the contested public opinion. The public is decidedly on the side of the workers here in terms of their issues, even knowing that it's going to cause them flight disruptions. And so the only message we can get here is that it's Ottawa taking the side of the employer in this dispute, because it's not to necessarily respond to public demand for this. It's also important to recognize that CUPE, the Air Canada component of CUPE, has not announced plans to return to work today. They actually sent out a message to their members and to the public saying that the strike is still on. So a big question to watch today is, will they or won't they? Will they actually show up at work? We are going to see some emergency rallies announced at airports across the country.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about what they're saying, that they don't intend to go back to work. But I'm just curious, you had mentioned this is sending a clear message that Ottawa is siding with the employer. So what do you think that says to other unions negotiating right now?
Yeah, it's really raising the question of, do charter rights exist or not at this point, right? Basically, we're in a situation now. This is the fourth time where in the past 2 years where workers have gone on strike and government has responded, quicker, more or less quickly with this novel use of Section 107 to override workers' charter protected right to strike and order them back to work. And so, the problem here is that we may be reaching a tipping point, right? Where if workers are getting the sense that the government is treating their charter rights with such disregard, why should they then, treat government orders with any differently than that, right? So I think that it's really creating a situation that is untenable for if we believe in charter rights in this country.
So the minister has actually called for binding arbitration. How does this actually work?
Yeah, so the minister herself cannot directly call for binding arbitration. What she's doing here with this invocation of this arcane part of the Canada Labour Code, Section 107, is essentially referring the case to the Canada Industrial Relations Board, who then basically does a investigation and decides whether it's an impasse, and at that point, calls for binding arbitration. What's interesting in this case is that there appears to be a pretty blatant conflict of interest involved, in that the person the official at the Canada Industrial Relations Board, who is charged with investigating this claim of impasse and deciding the course of action for the dispute, is actually a former Labour counsel for Air Canada itself. So it's a former legal counsel for the company in question who is being asked to make a ruling on the case. She's been asked to recuse herself, but has not done so. So it further poisons the well in terms of showing, in terms of what the government's sort of acting in good faith means, right? It really raises questions about that.
How do you see this unfolding if they do show up to the picket lines today and not go back to work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's going to be the real test, right? As a labor scholar, I'm thinking back to the 1960s when public sector workers were first fighting for the right to collectively bargain and the right to strike, and then Liberal Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, after whom our Toronto airport is named, said that, by if the law tells workers that they know that they cannot strike, we may inadvertently create the problem we're trying to solve. And I can't help but think that we may be recreating that same problem here in 2025.
What does this do for morale? I mean, you're forcing workers to go back to work in a situation they don't want to be in. I can't imagine they would do it enthusiastically.
Absolutely. What we're doing here is forcing workers to work against their will, right? We need to be clear about that. And they're working against their will because they're in a contract negotiation to address important issues regarding their working conditions through the collective bargaining process. And what they're seeing is the government is basically steamrolling their rights and preventing them from addressing these very real issues about unpaid work, about the cost of living, particularly for junior flight attendants, that are going to, and they need to find a way to address those at the bargaining table. And this ordering back to work does not address those issues and simply tries to put a lid on the conflict. And what we see from history is that this often has the effect of bubbling up later, perhaps in more agitated ways.
Well, what do you think this says about the balance of power in Canadian labor disputes right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in terms of the balance of power, yeah, it's the government putting the thumb on the scales for the employers. It's important to recognize here, I often say that, for collective bargaining to work, it needs to take place on something like a level playing field. And that requires some levers on both sides. Employers have many levers to exert power and coercion over their employees. Workers have one, which is the right to withdraw their labor or go on strike. And so by withdrawing that, by undermining that lever on the worker's side, it's tilting the playing field decidedly in the face of the employer and creating the dynamic we're seeing now, where rather than the strike serving as an incentive to actually reach agreement at the bargaining table, employers are getting the message from the government that they can just drag their feet, run out the clock, create chaos, whether it's at the airports or the ports or wherever, and use that chaos that they created by not reaching agreement at the table to call for their workers to be ordered back to work against their will. And so this is corrosive to the collective bargaining process, even if you might not care that much about the question of charter rights.
Binding arbitration is meant to be a compromise of sorts, but it sounds like you strongly feel as though this will not be a fair compromise. Now, Air Canada says it will take days to restore operations, even with flights resuming. Could this hurt their public image or labor relations long term? Because we've heard from a lot of people in the public who are very much on the side of the cabin crew.
Absolutely. I mean, to be fair, I don't think Air Canada was starting from a particularly high bar in terms of their public image. But this behavior towards their cabin crew, and remember, what we need to keep in mind here is that what Air Canada is saying is that they would rather create chaos for the flying public and even lose millions of dollars a day themselves rather than address key issues regarding unpaid work for flight attendants and poverty wages for junior flight attendants. So that's what they're going to the mat for. And so we really need to ask, what kind of company values is this portraying if they're willing to create that kind of chaos for the flying public, for their customers, in order to extract unpaid labor from their workers. It just doesn't make much sense.
Why do you think Air Canada thinks it has this much pull or seems to have this much pull? Do you think it ties into the fact that we don't have a lot of airline options in Canada?
I think it's because they know that they can get the government to order workers back to work and that they have the balance of power on their side. And so this is this is them essentially flexing that power. Obviously, yes, the fact that there are fewer options plays into this, but, the CUPE, the airline union, is also trying to raise standards at other airlines as well. They just organized the porter cabin crew, and they're going to be in negotiations at the other airlines too. And so this is an industry-wide issue of unpaid work, and they're going to be, they're starting first with Air Canada, but this is trying to set a pattern across the industry.
Okay, Barry, we appreciate your time today.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
That's labor expert Barry Eidlin.